We have a lot to cover in these videos in terms of warehouses, their science, and how they work. To start these sessions, we will start with this idea of understanding different types of warehouses. And to understand different type of warehouses, we will start by understanding different types of loads that a warehouse manages. Here, the first type of load that a warehouse manages are containers. Now, containers usually refer to shipping containers, and the most dominant types are the 20 feet and the 40 feet shipping containers. Most of them are always associated with international movement, imports and exports. So there has been some component of ocean associated with that movement. And these containers are very large, bulky, and they need special equipment to handle them. Now, beyond containers, what we come to is pallets. So usually containers are stuffed with palletized cargo. Not always, it's not compulsory, but it's a reasonable assumption. And even when we move things by trucks, usually we palletize our cargo because palletized cargo is easier to load, unload, and handle. So that's why we have this idea of palletized cargo. So pallet would have some wooden, steel, or plastic base, and you would have all these cartons packed on that. And generally, the cartons are shrink wrapped so that we can prevent pilferage or spillage and any kind of destruction to those goods. So that's the second part, which we call as pallets. Now, the third kind of cargo that we talk about is cases. So, pallets, like we saw, is made up of cases, and individual cases are also part of a cargo. So, these cases are basically corrugated boxes, cardboard boxes, and these boxes generally have multiple purposes. One among them is safety, their ability to, because they're stocked on one top of each other, so they have to have that load bearing capacity. There has to have some adequate labeling so that identification and reasonable handling becomes easier. But that's the idea of cases. Next, beyond those cases, is we something have called as grouped units. So units may not even inside cases. The units may be packed together in units, bunches of threes, fours, sometimes in dozens. So, but the idea is you would have much more branding visible when we talk of these grouped units, and so sometimes some cases we could be handling grouped units, and the final side type of the product is what we call eaches. So these eaches are individual products that are the smallest unit which a consumer could buy. That's the definition we use for eaches, the smallest unit that a consumer could buy. Now, once we know these different type of products, let's look into the different types of warehouses which have a very different profile in the kind of products they handle. So the first thing we have here are what we call as container freight stations. Now, container freight stations, as the name suggests, primarily would be handling containers. And they would usually be close to ports, either shipping ports or in some cases inland ports. Now, container freight stations do this task. So, one task is, well, customers fill in or suppliers fill in containers at their supplier facility. They send it to the container freight station, and container freight station loads those suppliers onto ships or sends it over to be loaded onto ships. Second is this idea that ships come, the containers are unloaded, they moved out from the dock and are stored at container freight stations, and then the containers are sent to the customers wherever they are destined to. Those are simple operations. A third operation could be that customers send individual pallets, and those pallets are stuffed inside the container at a container freight station. So container freight stations also do provide these stuffing services, and this is the idea of services I told you a little while back in the previous video. So container freight station provide these stuffing services also, or in some cases container freight stations could provide de-stuffing services where you break up your pallet and send individual, you break up your container, open your container and break it up into individual pallets which could be sent to different consumers. So while the input can be a pallet or a container, and the output also can be a pallet or a container, one thing that a container freight station is designed, or rather not designed to do, is individual eaches, or even in case of group sets. Ideally, a container freight station can only handle these larger chunks of material. It's designed to handle these larger chunks of material only. A second thing that a container freight station, a second type of warehouse that is available to us is what we call as central distribution centers or regional distribution centers. Now, these warehouses would be slightly away from the manufacturer or the freight station. So what a central distribution center would do is central distribution center would typically receive pallets, and they would then break the pallets, as in not physically, but actually divide the pallet into cases, and then generally they would dispatch cases. Or in some cases, let's say they receive a truckload of one SKU. So they receive 30 pallets or 20 pallets of one SKU. Well, in that case, what a central freight state or central distribution center would do is those to divide those 20 pallets into the different 20 regions where it's sending those goods. So they divide those pallet level loads generally. A regional distribution center is a little bit removed from the central distribution center. It goes closer to the consumers and away from the CFS or the manufacturing facility. And RDC, regional distribution center, it breaks open even further. It disaggregates the goods even further. So what RDC does is it gets those individual pallets and then starts handling goods at case level. So it would send cases to individual stores. Now, a few things to note here is the frequency is different in CDC and RDC. Since the average weight or the bulk handled by a CDC or a central distribution center is larger, they would typically receive goods, let's say, from 3 manufacturing facilities or 5 manufacturing facilities and dispatch it to 20 RDCs, right? That's what they would do. And so their frequency of movement inside the warehouse would not be very high, but the weight of each movement would probably be very high. When you move to RDC, what changes is that now an RDC is receiving material from maybe 10 different CDCs and also dispatching material to maybe 50 different retail stores. So as you can see, the frequency of movement at an RDC increases. And because that frequency increases, also another thing, that weight carried per shipment also reduces generally. And this changes the profile of the material handling devices that we have at these two locations. So CDC would be content to have different type of forklift operators depending on the space available. They would have the basic forklift, or if there is a narrow space, it's an expensive city where they have the warehouses, they might, CDC would generally never be in an expensive location. But again, that's the idea. You would want, basic type of material handling devices. In an RDC, you might see more modern devices, which would be space constrained or space saving and all those devices, so that we optimize on space and save cost. Because remember, the RDCs go closer to the consumers or the retailers or customers. So that's what is the difference between the CDC and the RDC. A very different type of warehouses here are the e-commerce warehouses. Now, e-commerce warehouses are completely different animals. You cannot have a CDC also function as an e-commerce warehouse. One of the things that the e-commerce warehouses does, you see, is that they're generally single level warehouses. They don't stack material too high. And it is obvious because there's so much picking that has to be done by pickers, whether automated or manual, that you can't have material stocked substantially at high levels. E-commerce warehouses handle eaches, or in some cases grouped units. They dispatch eaches. So they would input cases come in, or in some cases pallets come in at e-commerce centers. The pallets are broken, the cases are broken open, and eaches are stocked. And eaches, or in some cases grouped units, are what are dispatched in e-commerce units. E-commerce units are very busy, very high frequency operations. Weight per operation is very low. And another thing that happens there is that they have super high use of technology. You would see massive amounts of sorting, some kinds of automation. So you could search for videos on Kiva robots at Amazon warehouses. But these are all hot hub of technology. So now these are at its basic 3 different types of warehouses according to their activity or the position in the supply chain. To give you a perspective on what we just said, all these 4 type of warehouses have been ranked here according to their frequency, number of SKUs, etc. So the CFS, the frequency would not be very high. it would be the lowest among all. Again, there are different types of CSS and different types of e-commerce warehouses. Okay, so this is not a 100% definite rule. I'm giving you a general, on an average rule. CFS would have the lowest frequency of transactions. A fulfillment center would have substantially very high frequency of transactions. The number of SKUs, well, I put an NA in CFS because you don't have fixed SKUs. The containers that keep coming always keep changing. So that's why I put a not applicable as far as CFS is concerned. Um, CDC receives material from 3 or 4 different plants, or so they wouldn't have a super high range of SKUs. But when you look at fulfillment centers, they could have as much as 30,000, 50,000 different SKUs that they service. Same thing for outbound and inbound. The inbound is generally, when you talk of CFS, they're generally talking of containers and pallets, versus when you talk of the other extreme, which is the fulfillment centers, they are talking of each as every individual product. And lastly, the weight also changes according to the type of weight handle per shipment. Also changes according to the type of warehouse. The containers are 20 feet, 40 feet, obviously becoming the most heavy form of storage units which are managed. But the fulfillment centers have the lightest because they tackle of eaches. And all these, one thing you should tell you is the design of warehouses will be very different according to the purpose for which we have decided to use the specific warehouses. So when we decide to use a warehouse close to the manufacturing facility or close to the port, we would use the principles, understand what a CFS load profile is typically, and design what we call as CFS. Something which is closer to the CFS or closer to the manufacturing facility is called a CDC, or a central distribution center. When it goes closer to the retailer, the customers, which are the consumers or the retailers, we would get something which is called an RDC. And finally, we have the retail stores. This is a traditional brick and mortar supply chain. Again, not every supply chain needs to have a CFS, or not every supply chain needs to have a CDC and RDC. And this is just a generic representation of what these different type of warehouse would look like if all of them were present in the supply chain.